So we will get started, and that's our first question, which we talked about, is how are you addressing sexual violence and public accountability in your current roles?
All right. Well, thank you, Monika. I am really glad to be back here with all of you. You know, doing this work has been sort of something I started with Polly 40 years ago, when we passed the Illinois Sexual Assault Act in 1984. So that's like a really long time ago. But today, so what I'm doing and continue to do, I've gone back into private practice at Buckley LLP, and I started there a workplace cultural compliance practice. Because what I saw from the work I did at the White House Council on Women and Girls, where we pursued a working families agenda and had the first ever White House Summit on working families in 2014, that a lot of companies wanted, even then, before Me Too started, back then companies wanted to do the right thing around how do we address equal pay, how do we do something about making sure more women are promoted and included in our businesses, but didn't know what to do. And then a lot of times it was their lawyers, as Tony will appreciate, their general counsel saying, yeah, maybe don't do that equal pay study, because we don't actually want to make the record that we've got an equal pay problem and have the lawyers come after us on that. So being a lawyer, I thought one of the things that could be helpful is to actually help companies do better and figure it out, and that's this workplace culture compliance practice that I started at Buckley. Because I think we also have to be a little humble about this work, which is, we don't really know what works and what doesn't work. There's been very little research, and I know Tony will talk about the data that they're developing at Uber. There's been very little data on sexual violence, as Dr. Arias knows. There's been very little data on sexual harassment in the workplace. There's been very little data on what really works on making sure we have inclusive workplace environments. Because incidences are not reported, they're not studied, therefore, and what we do know from Me Too is that what we've been doing for the last 30 years, so let's be clear, it's been over 30 years since sexual harassment was outlawed as a matter of US federal law, and yet, here we are, where we are with Me Too and with the increasing numbers that we see of women and men coming forward to report incidents of violence. 80%, the surveys show that 80% of working women have experienced sexual harassment, right, at some point in their workplace. So we don't know, we've got to actually really say what we've been doing for the last 30 years hasn't worked. So we've got to start working on new things. We have to have the courage, as I want to commend Tony and Uber for starting to collect data, and for starting to be honest about the need for that, and to start to create ways in which companies can be bold and both work on prevention, work on data collection, work on experimenting, which is hard for companies to do, on what will work or not. But that is the work I've been doing, I'm very excited about. And then there's an accountability factor. So the other thing I do in my not day job is, as you noted, is to work on Time's Up. So I had the good fortune to sort of know many of the women who were gathering in the wake of the Harvey Weinstein articles in October of 2017, and who are really getting together originally just to support one another. But to their credit, these women of Hollywood very quickly turned that personal pain into action, to what can we do to help support other women in the workplace, especially women who are not as fortunate as they were as actresses to have platforms and stature, and low-income women in particular. And so that gave birth to Time's Up as an organization, and specifically its first major project, the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, which I'm proud to have put together, housed at the National Women's Law Center, where we've raised over $25 million in support of women and men coming forward who've experienced sexual harassment, who need a lawyer, who need PR support. We've had over 5,000 people come forward to seek assistance. In that time, 60 different industries, 2/3 of which are in low-income communities. But I'm also proud to say, for Tony's and my profession, over 800 lawyers who've also come forward to volunteer their time on a pro bono or low-cost basis, yes, to help support those women.
So we're one of the companies that Tina is helping. And before I talk about Uber, let me just first say thank you, Monika. Thank you for having me here. And thank all of you for the work that you do every day. Really half of my legal career has been spent in public service, specifically in the Department of Justice, and I spent my early years as a prosecutor. Most of the crimes that I prosecuted as a federal prosecutor were crimes of sexual violence involving children and women. And my time at the U.S. Department of Justice in the Obama administration as a senior official there, much of that work also involved whether it was reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act, working with Tina, or working on issues of violence against Native women. This has been a big part of my own personal interest in public service. And I share that with you because when you sort of fast forward to where I am now, the chair that I'm sitting in now at Uber, that's what informs my perspective on a lot of this. And why I think this is important. You know, one of the reasons why those of us who go into government is because of the scale of impact that you can have in improving people's lives. And it's one of the things that was so attractive to me about Uber. You know, we do 16 million trips a day around the world. That's about 45 trips a second. Okay, so what that means is in proposition, what has to be core is this idea of trust. We're asking you 45 times a second to trust us with your data, to trust us with your person, right? And we have to earn that 45 seconds, 45 times a second. And so that's why when I think about safety, it is absolutely endemic to the brand proposition that we have to earn your trust by making sure that we are providing the safest platform possible, particularly when it comes to the safety of women, because we know that, and I believe that if you improve the safety of the platform for women, you will actually improve it for everyone. And the reason I believe that is, we've seen New York Times actually done some good work on this, where they have talked about how women experience travel differently than men. That women have to think about things that men simply take for granted when moving from point A to point B. And so if you focus on that and improving that, then I believe you actually improve the platform safety for everyone. And so, what does that mean? That means that as we kind of think about how to do that, it's important for us to reach out to experts who've been working in not just the safety field generally, but specifically when it comes to the safety of women, and particularly on this issue of sexual violence. And so for me, it's sort of like a full circle kind of moment in terms of my own career. And so we've been very fortunate to work with groups like NSVRC and Kristen, like the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, Ebony Tucker, with RALIANCE, to help us begin to think about how do we make this platform the safest it can be. And then not only to listen, but then to incorporate those ideas into the product and into our approaches, which we've done and we'll talk a little bit about.
And thank you both for kind of highlighting your full circle career. I think there's a lot of assumption, especially from those of us who spent our entire career in public service or nonprofit, that many of the folks at the corporate level don't really understand the need to address this, but most importantly, recognizing the most vulnerable. So I appreciate you acknowledging in what you said, language, our language would be that you recognize the privilege that men have in traveling, that women don't have, and so recognizing that for us truly is a sign of culture change. And so thank you for lifting that up, and thank you to the staff who've worked very closely with Uber to ensure that we're starting to do that across the entire corporation. So you both are talking to us about the work that you've done, and we recognize that you are doing that also because it's a place that you believe in, because you've done it your entire career. But talk to me about what do you think for corporations who don't have Tina and Tony at their corporate head, how would you explain to them or talk to them about how do they overcome the bad headlines and still commit to do this kind of culture change work?
So I think it starts, it really does start with a willingness to be transparent and to be humble, to be completely, I've been at Uber for less than 2 years, and I think one of the things, Dara Khosrowshahi, the new CEO, has been there for just 2 years. I was his first hire. You all know 2017 was a difficult year for Uber, to say the least. This is a true story. I came to Uber in November of 2017. About 6 months before that, I was the general counsel. At the time, I was the general counsel of PepsiCo. I came from PepsiCo to Uber. But about 6 months before I went to Uber, before I was even thinking about Uber, I'm in my office at PepsiCo with a colleague. We just finished a meeting. On my conference table is the New York Times, and I just sort of pick it up and start to leaf through it. And there's this front page story that's talking about Uber and all of the crazy things that are going on in this company, you know, the Susan Fowler blog and the Delete Uber movement and all of this stuff, and the board's at war with itself. And I remember just sort of scanning that and then tossing the paper on the conference table and saying to my colleague, man, I'm glad I'm not the GC of that company, because they got some real problems. And now I'm the GC of that company that had some real problems. And I think one of the things that was really important for us to do immediately was to acknowledge we had some real problems and we needed help. We could not, the thinking and the culture that got us into the mess that we were in couldn't get us out of the hole that we were in. And so we had to reach out in a spirit of humility and transparency and say, look, we've got issues, we need to turn to experts who can help us with this set of problems, right? And that's, you know, you say those words and it's really easier said than done, because, I mean, as we all know, the most meaningful relationships are those relationships that are based on trust, and that means that there is vulnerability in those relationships. And so that requires companies to be vulnerable. And so, you know, the question is, how do you, those companies that aren't there yet, what do they need to do? I think that the first step is a willingness to have the humility to know that you can't solve the same thinking that got you into the problem is not going to help you get out of it. And then secondly, being willing to be humble enough and vulnerable enough that you can find a partner that will help, or partners who will help you to make the transition. And I think that for us, that was really, really important. You know, whether it's now sharing lots of data with these partners to really help us think through how do we begin to solve this issue. I think that's what companies have to do.
So the thing that, so I've been doing this work a long time, and I was a corporate lawyer, you know, for 23 years before I went to the White House, so I've been advising companies for a long time. And what's interesting about what's occurred over the last 2 years, right, since the fall of 2017, is a real sea change, I think, in the way the corporate thinking is on these issues. You know, employment law, sexual harassment, was all usually 4 or 5 levels down below the general counsel, you know, and the job of HR was just to contain the problem and contain employee costs and not look for patterns, not look for systemic issues. What Me Too has done is really elevate this issue to demonstrate to companies that there is real enterprise risk here, as Uber lived through in 2017, as CBS, you know, go down the list of headlines over the course of the last 2 years. They've now, companies who aren't in the headlines are watching their, you know, compatriots out there and seeing that there is real enterprise risk if they do not address these issues. But more importantly, and we're benefiting from a tight labor market right now, that they're also realizing they're in a war for talent. And they're in a war for talent, especially among millennial employees and millennial customers who research tells us are making value-based decisions on where they want to work, what services and products they want to buy from companies that represent their values. So both on the upside and on the negative side, companies are now, and CEOs and C-suite executives see these issues in a very different light, which is one of my premises, which is we've got to elevate these issues beyond HR. These are C-suite boardroom issues. They are every bit as critical to a company's success as your R&D in a new technology, right? Or the investments that you're making in building a new manufacturing plant. You have to be looking at them constantly. You have to apply rigor in your analysis. You have to look for patterns across your company, which means you have to collect the data, you have to empower your employees, and you have to create a culture, which is why my practice is called a workplace culture practice, which is you can't segment, discrimination and harassment over here, and hiring and promotion over here, and looking at, our overall business investments over here. Culture is infused throughout everything you do, and so you've got to look at these cohesively and holistically. The good news I will report is, and kind of why actually my practice is working. When I started this, I had no idea, and I actually started this practice literally 3 weeks before the first Harvey Weinstein article appeared. I had a very funny conversation with our old boss. So, the President Obama sort of knew this was an idea I had for what I wanted to do with my practice. I saw him a few months after the Harvey Weinstein article had appeared, and he looks to me and says, "Did y'all plan that?" Did you have? No, really had nothing to do with it. Just luck and timing in your life sometimes works out. But there is traction in the practice because now companies really are seeing it. I've seen Wall Street companies and manufacturing companies, not just Silicon Valley companies, people who are investing, who employ blue-collar hourly workers, coming to the table with a very heightened awareness. Their investors are asking them about it, right? So investors who are investing in companies are starting to put clauses in, tell us whether you've had sexual harassment complaints and what you're gonna do about them. So there's a real sea change shift for corporate America, I think. I believe, public advocacy, as we know, is important, but, we'll never be able to pass through this Congress the kind of legislation that an Uber, and can with a stroke of the pen, in its employee conduct, or changing how it's going to address rider concerns, and shift for those 45 million riders per second, 45 riders per second. You got really big also.
That'd be quite a big scale.
Right. But you can have that scale and that impact far more quickly than we can get a piece of legislation through Congress, and with great scope, and quite frankly, going beyond the legal limits of the law that we often have. So the other piece that's happening is we realize the public policy that's out there has set the bar for bad behavior really low, and too low, right? Title VII law is, sets a bar for bad behavior that's really low, but companies now are realizing that, realizing the culture they want needs to be higher, and they're gonna set that bar higher. And I believe firmly that the companies that do this right today are the ones that will still be around and successful 10 years from now, and those that don't actually will not be.
I mean, that's well said, and I think, a couple of things I want to lift up as my alarm over there tells me it's time. And Tony and I both looked around, I was like, oh, I left my alarm over there. But I can hear it, it's coming to a close. But one of the things I do want to lift up is many of our local programs and nonprofits across the country are paying attention to the way that we're elevating the need to start to engage across sectors. That's both the nonprofits who have worked in this field as the experts around this work, but also how are they going to engage with the corporations who have a home base in their communities. And so I guess if you would share with us kind of your thoughts about, we recognize that these are two different sectors with very different pathways, and what advice or how would you talk to about making those kind of connections, and then what could it be? It may not be the C-suite, although some of our communities do have home-based companies, but a lot of them may have a very large manufacturing company that's just based in their community, but their home may be global. And so any advice or thoughts that you have about that?
Well, I think, first of all, many of you I know, as my longtime friends and advocates, you come from an advocacy world, and Monika, that's been your career. And when you come from the advocacy world, there's a hesitancy. I mean, let's be honest, right? There is a suspicion and a hesitancy to work with corporations, right? That's sort of not who you're used to working with. It's who you're used to holding accountable, who you are used to, with good reason, often railing against. So that's an initial hurdle, is to get over that tendency that we have in the advocacy world to not, to be partners with companies as opposed to seeing them as targets for our advocacy. So that's the first hurdle. Now, I recognize you have to be thoughtful in how you do that, because it is true that sometimes the companies with the worst stories, you know, and honestly, Uber was like that, right? So it was risky in the beginning for some of the advocacy partners that Tony starts reaching out to step into that fray when the Susan Fowler memo is out there and your other allies are saying, why are you working with Uber? So there's a little bit of, you know, you have to be thoughtful about who you're engaging with. I think you have to, but I would engage with them and see if they are sincere. And if they are sincerely wanting to work, then I would suggest to you it is worth taking the leap of faith. Because if we don't take the leap of faith as advocates, and you are the people in this room, and I often say this, you know, of the organizations, you know, NAACP and the rape crisis coalitions around the state, you are the people who are seeing victims every day. You understand what they're going through, you understand the dimensions of the problem in ways that many people do not, and what companies really need if we're going to have them improve in the ways in which we all in this room want them to improve, which is to have victim-informed policies, victim-informed investigation protocols, support that it really is based upon, you know, what victims really experience and prevention strategies that address that. Then you need to bring that information to the table because no one else will. Or actually somebody else will who doesn't have that information. So I think that's one of the things that we have to do. And you're right that it does not mean you have to be going to the C-suite. So my point about it needs to be housed there is important, but it's also important to engage with your local fast food restaurant, with your local, you know, the people who are in your communities. If you're in a rural community, go to the local Walmart store and talk to them. You don't have to go to Walmart in Little Rock in order to figure that out. And that groundswell will start to, you know, build. And it will, you will benefit the companies, and then, you know, obviously they will become, you know, partners and supporters with you in your work more broadly in the community. But I do think there is an initial mindset we all have to get over, you know, and then we all have to recognize there's some risk, because the company that you work with today may still have a problem, right? Because the numbers suggest no matter how well somebody does something, there's always going to be a problem. But what you want to know is that even though a problem arose, that they are then addressing it in the right way. They are supporting the victim who's coming forward. They're doing the right things with their policies and their training, even though those things are happening.
I just want to underscore everything. I will associate myself with all of those remarks. I mean, you know, it's so you know, it's interesting because I talk about how it's important. We're a tech company. We engage risk in the name of innovation every single day, right? That's our business model. So I've argued it's important for us to engage risk to be a corporate leader on these issues, particularly around sexual violence. It is important to engage that kind of risk too. But in order to really be able to do that, we need your help. We need your partnership. And so, you know, when you look at whether it's the decision we made to end mandatory arbitration for claims of sexual assault, sexual harassment, to end the use of confidentiality agreements there, those are policy changes which, when we made them at the time, were leadership moves, frankly, moves that made some people nervous, because usually it's not the lawyer who's saying, hey, let's engage in legal liability potential. But you know, made some people internally nervous. It did increase the costs for about a year. Now we've seen that those costs have come back down to normal. But having advocates help us to inform the way we talked about and made those policy changes and made sure that they were victim-centered, that was incredibly important. You know, when you talk about the transparency report, we've announced that we're going to release a transparency report that chronicles all of the most difficult safety incidents on our platform, including sexual violence that occurs on our platform. Now, you know, as I said before, this is not an Uber problem, this is a society problem. But the reality is Uber is a reflection of the society it serves. You know, those 16 million trips we do a day, that means the 1 in a million thing happens to us 16 times a day, right? That will happen on that platform. So it's important to have data that tells us what's going on, and then it's important for us to be able to be in a position to act against that data. Well, how do you begin to do that? You know, that's why we reached out to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, who helped to give us a way of cataloging those incidents, gave us a taxonomy, a way to actually train our own people and how they catalog these incidents, and then a way for us, helped us with a way for us to present that data, which we'll be doing later this year. That's incredibly important. Now that's a leap of faith that they made on us because, as Tina said, we had some problems, right? But I guess what I would say is we need that help, we need that patience, right? Because it is also true that this is a journey, it's not a destination. We will make improvement, we will get better and better and better, and there will still be things that happen, because as long as there is a cultural problem with sexual violence, that will be reflected on our platform. So as long as that exists, we will have those incidents, but we will never tire, and we should never cease in trying to continue to mitigate, prevent, and improve. We can only do that, though, with the help of all of you. And so, that's a really important point.
And then I want to raise 2 additional points. So once this happens, right? I mean, Uber is a good kind of example paradigm to use. So it had a really highly publicized problem, brought in a new leadership team. The new leadership team is doing several things, both internally around its own employees. So there were several recent announcements, even that the relatively new chief diversity officer and inclusion officer at Uber has been making. So it's both on the platform, on safety, and internally with their employees. And then as advocates, there are 2 other things that start to happen when this occurs. And that is, there are people who want to hang on to Uber's bad actor, so we aren't going to partner with them. But we have to, as advocates, recognize when people start to do good things. We've got to be able to have the courage as advocates to then step forward and say, all right, now I am not going to delete Uber, I'm going to take Uber, or I'm going to partner with them, because we want to encourage that. We want to encourage when they improve to recognize improvement and give credit for that. And because that is the only way, everybody, that the rest of corporate America that's making decisions based on profit and loss and what works and not are going to see that it is profitable and beneficial to do positive things in this area, right? We hold that responsibility to say, when a company that's been in trouble takes and sincerely addresses it, we have to give them the credit to do that, right? We can't just completely be at the barricades all the time. So that's number 1. And then number 2, I want to also be really candid about something else that I'm seeing in the movement. And that is, we have allies, right? And the great thing is there has been, in the last 2 years, a groundswell of allies and coalitions being built. You are the originators of anti-sexual violence work, but there are now people who are in the equal pay space, right? Or union advocates, or others who care about the broader issues around workplaces, who are coming to the fore happily, right? To support the victims of sexual harassment and sexual violence, to help make workplaces better. But as we're doing that coalition work, I think we also have to be clear what your agenda is and where the agenda is on sexual harassment and sexual violence, and to recognize that as always happens in coalitions, not everybody's agendas are always going to line up. And when you line up together, that is great. But you also have to be, I think, honest with each other and clear when your interests diverge. So what I mean, be really specific. Unions have been our great allies in a lot of issues, and on this issue in particular. But we also have to recognize that there may come a point, and I'll continue to use Uber as an example, where Uber's got issues around contract and gig economy and drivers. The unions have a particular viewpoint on that. That viewpoint that the unions have around contract and gig drivers isn't necessarily the same as our effort as advocates around safe workplaces and sexual harassment and ending sexual violence have. We may join together at some point, but at some point we may have to diverge and recognize when work is being done to help make sure those drivers are safe and to make sure the riders in those cars are safe. That when that starts to happen, pursuing the whole issue of gig economy and drivers as employees may not be our issue, and we should not let our issue be used by other allies for their own ends when it doesn't actually meet our ends.
Well said. I mean, to both of you. I mean, thank you for circling back, Tina.
That's another conference right there.
It really is.
Yeah.
I literally had the same thought. I was like, we could have a whole conference on partnership. I mean, because one of the wrap up for me really is for the field to recognize that many of you will remember now, almost 15 years ago, we started our work very diligently and intentionally in the military space. And then we moved to the campus space. Actually, that took up all of the Obama administration. Those 8 years we were in the campus space. And now we've moved to the corporate space. And I think that speaks to the real sea change that we see. And quite frankly, the hunger that other industries have, because they recognize all of them are reflections of our society. And so until there's true cultural change and a true shift in preventing sexual violence, and we talked about there's still research and there's not hard evidence on how we're going to switch it. Let's be clear, we're talking human beings. We're not going to switch it on a dime, right? So this is a long game, and I tell advocates all the time, this work is about the long game. And a part of being in the long game is knowing clarity on what's my agenda. And we have asked as RALIANCE for people to be bold. We've asked for them to take risks and engage with partners like Uber who may not be aligned with what you value as an advocate and what your 20, 30 years of experience has been. But if we really want to see change, some of us have to take the risk. And we get to decide. And I tell folks all the time, some of us are going to say we cannot make that kind of risk. It goes against all of my principles. And there are others of us who are saying the breakthrough for me has been Me Too, and to go beyond that is to really venture in spaces where it may not be what we thought we would be doing, but it is what we need to be doing to end sexual violence in one generation.
And I'll tell you, in terms of just impact, I mean, it is those companies that need the most help, which perhaps look the worst, that will benefit the most from your involvement and your engagement. That's certainly been our experience. The reason Uber hired me, the reason I ran to that fire is because my background was one that they needed. I'd been a regulator, I'd been the GC of a global company. They needed that. And it was a value add. In the same way, we need you and other companies need you to help them make that transition and to be able to do the right thing.
Well, thank you both very much. I see Karen over here. I also want to note that Joyce should be very proud that people are rushing to get a seat in their workshops. So job well done. Job well done to the PCAR staff, and thank you, Karen. I'm taking note. And thank you, Tony and Tina, for your time.